Hello survivors and welcome to Now That's What I Call Survival Horror, the first aid spray show where we discuss various soundtracks from the survival horror genre, most specifically Resident Evil, and in this case, most specifically Resident Evil 2 2019 RE2 Remake. My name is Psy. I am joined on this episode by Kelsi.
Greetings, Earthlings.
And this episode is all about me. This was my game to choose. I feel like I have some things to say about the Remake 2 soundtrack. So I have gone through it. I have picked out my favourites. I have numbered them from 10 down to 1 like we do in every episode of this show. This is all opinion based, and there are going to be some opinions on both sides, and we'd love to hear your opinions. So if you're watching this on YouTube, head down to the comments and let us know what you think of the Remake 2 soundtrack. What are your highlights? What did you feel like was missed out of this list? And also, I've got a question for everyone, listening / watching this. And also you, Kelsi. I think famously, Remake 2 released with the classic soundtrack DLC. And I know there are people out there, and there are people on our panel that I think have never played the game with the original score that comes actually packaged with the game, and instead just opt for the 98 version, which is totally fair because it's excellent, as we previously discussed, and it works really shockingly well. You've played a lot of Remake 2. What side of the fence do you go? Do you often go for the nostalgia thing, or do you leave the original soundtrack on as intended?
Yeah, when the very first time I played it with the 98 soundtrack.
Really?
Which sounds like, it sounds like such a disservice to this game, and we'll probably touch on this a bit more as we go on. But yeah, I think I discovered really late when the game was coming out that you could play it with the original soundtrack, and for me, I was like, it was like one of the number one selling points. I was like, wow, yes, can't wait to do that. So it was a few playthroughs. Like I was on maybe my third playthrough before I eventually heard the original soundtrack. But now a lot more. So a weird thing happened when I got my Series X. I lost all the DLC for this game, and I haven't actually played Remake 2 with the 98 soundtrack for about a year, and I've played it a lot in the past year, and it's always been with the new original score that came with it. So yeah, I started with the OG one, but yeah, I've definitely come to love the new one, which we're going to get into.
Interesting. That boggles my mind. I couldn't see myself doing that at all. But yeah, I know people have a lot of opinions about this soundtrack, or lack thereof, I think people feel like, which is a fair criticism. It won awards for its sound design, but I think the soundtrack was a point of contention for most people because it's quite absent from the game, which I think is a shame, because when you listen to it in isolation, there's some really good stuff in there. A lot of it is around kind of like the action-packed moments and the boss fights and stuff that you'd expect, but there are some nice pieces of music that they haven't really mostly made this list. In all fairness, but some like the incidental music does exist for Remake 2, and it is it's pretty decent, surprisingly so, I think.
Yeah, I think I agree. There's a few, like 2 or 3 tracks that have always stuck out to me, but it isn't really until doing this. I think this is probably the first time I've sat through and listened to it a couple of times intently on headphones, and I sent you a little message just saying, I can't believe actually how good this is.
Right. Yeah.
And yeah, it's taken me by surprise. There's a lot of good stuff on here.
I don't think I've publicly banged the drum for the soundtrack enough, but I've always said that people should absolutely check it out in that fashion, because I do think it's going to surprise people. But unless you got anything else, let's not delay. Let's get into number 10, I think.
Let's go for it.
Cool. Well, number 10, starting things off perhaps very appropriately right at the beginning. Number 10 is Raccoon City. So, like the section of the game that this music plays over, I wish we had more of it. I wish we had more of Raccoon City Streets. I know that's a fairly popular opinion. That's not a surprise. We'd get more of an opportunity to hear this music as well. That very much reminds me of the same vibe of the '98 version. The big reverberating drums that immediately give you that tension about what's going on, your surroundings and the hellscape that you've been pretty much just dropped into, which is again the same with RE2, save for the gas station sort of, if you want to call it a tutorial with Remake 2. After that's over, it just goes boom, here you are in the middle of the street surrounded by fire and zombies, which was nice. So that they start exactly the same in that fashion, and the music very much reminds me of the original in that way. You've got the RE2 theme, the leitmotif, which is going to come up again and again throughout this. So just to be more specific about that, what I'm referring to is the da 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 da, and that is sprinkled in throughout all of the soundtrack, which is nice. But to kick things off with this as well, and in the way that I love about a lot of Resident Evil music, this kind of straddles that line of a coherently structured piece of music and also just waves of atmosphere and texture that are just, and as you just said, with headphones, there's stuff going on in different corners at all different times. It's just layers of tension and that kind of thing, which is exactly what you want. I don't have a lot more to say other than that. I just felt it was a really solid way to kick off the game. And I wish that we got more of this piece of music and of Raccoon City Streets in general.
Yeah, and you know what? I don't think I'm imagining this. Although this is a much longer track, it has weirdly the same pace and sound and feel of that 15-second intro to the title screen from the original. You know, the percussion you mentioned.
Yeah,
maybe
actually,
this is something. It feels like it feels like this is the first. You know, obviously this piece of music is way less retro and more modern. And as we've mentioned, the soundtrack has homages to the original kind of all over it. But I think this is the first one, and I reckon it's a little callback to that. And it could just be, sometimes you fill in the gaps with these things. But
right.
The percussion, it overshadows most of the track, but it definitely has something that really sucks you in. It feels very much like a chase. Those strings could kind of be anything whizzing by, like a train, somebody sprinting away from zombies or a pack of dogs or something. And you're spot on with the borderline incoherent thing, which is kind of like a funny way to describe it, but they've made it work, and there's something really unique about that. And then it's a bit like I was having to think about this. It's like the composer walked into the room, sort of gave some tempo notes and just went go nuts to everybody, and they all just danced around each other. And I think this might be the closest we'll ever get to survival horror jazz.
That's an amazing statement right there. I think I'd like to challenge that. I hope it's not the case. I hope we get some more survival horror jazz. Amazing. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the classic '98 intro, but you're right. It is very similar to that, the percussion stuff. Definitely. It really does conjure up that classic. You've heard countless stories, and my own Resident Evil origin story starts with I booted up RE2 and I died immediately because I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And this conjures up that same feeling. With Remake 2, the control scheme is a lot more forgiving and a lot more known, let's put it that way. People are very used to this kind of style of gameplay, and you're not immediately overwhelmed. So I don't know. Actually, I say I don't know anyone that's died there, but I do. But that's on them for staring intently at the backgrounds and stuff like that, But it's very unlikely that you're actually going to get into a proper scrape in this very short moment. But it goes okay, big scary horror, everything's happening kind of music. So it's a perfect way to kick off the game for me.
Yeah. So you say that. Obviously, I've sped run this game many times, and the amount of times I've just directly ran straight into that first group of zombies is not one I care to admit, but it's more than 5.
Fair enough.
Because you're kind of on autopilot, and you're just like, oh, yeah, that was incorrect.
I guess so, yeah. Okay, let's go in a different direction. Number 9 is The Straight and Winding. So this one is quite a unique one. As I said, a lot of this music is going to be fairly upbeat or up-tempo kind of stuff, so it's unique in that sense. But I would actually say that if this game was going to have its own new save room theme that didn't riff on anything pre-existing, I think it's this. And I don't think people realise or talk about the fact that this is kind of a save room theme, because it plays in a very specific save room that I don't think... If you return to the room, I don't think it plays the classic. I should have checked this beforehand, but I don't think it plays the classic 98 save room. I think it's always playing this. The room in question is the room in the sewers with the typewriter, obviously with the typewriter in the item box, where you put the chest plugs in, the puzzle. So it's that particular part. And it's really interesting that they picked a unique piece of music for this part in the game and didn't just go, oh, this is the new save room theme. And I think that it's really effective because, especially in Claire's scenario, at this point in the game, things have really kind of changed up. Because we've now got Sherry in danger. We've met Annette, and we've kind of seen the relationship between those two, which is terribly fractured. So we have our own sort of goal here at this point, beyond just get out, which is sort of how I feel about the situation that Leon is in a bit more. It's a bit more simple. Obviously, as we all know, kind of Claire's campaign has a bit more meat to it in that sense. And also, rather appropriately, in Claire's scenario at this point, Mr. X has just been ended by Birkin. So it's a nice piece of music to take a breather to, because you don't have to deal with a tyrant when you go back up into the police station after this. In terms of the music, though, rather than just talking about where it plays, this piece of music I really needed to include here because it's just the perfect example of Remake 2's specific musical identity. And what I mean by that is it has this kind of ghostly droning sound that appears throughout a lot of the incidental and a lot of the downplayed music. All throughout the OST, it's just a lot of light and airy stuff that is debatably light on actual content and melody and stuff. It is just sort of like the atmosphere of, as you said, sort of stuff rushing by your ears, but maybe not rushing in this case, but sort of gentle gust of musical wind almost. And if you've got the headphones on with this one, you do get some sort of ambient stuff on top of that that's much more mechanical. You get sort of like the hum of the machines in the sewers you can kind of hear, and these sort of strange tapping sounds, which I always appreciate, and arguably perhaps a throwback to the 98 version, which has a lot of that like banging and crashing going on. I think this is a wonderful piece of music, to be honest.
Yeah, very well put. I completely agree about that point of how this is perfect for Claire, and then for Leon it kind of makes no sense. But it's not. Is this used in Leon's, or is it different for Leon's?
I think it is. I think it's in both, but again, I should have done the research.
No, but that's fine. I mean, either way, it's kind of it doesn't really matter. But yeah, you think about what happened to Leon. It's like, okay, he's dodged a crocodile, and this strange woman has messed him around and fallen into some rubbish, and he's got to get out. Whereas Claire has the whole Sherry deal, and Sherry and Annette, and you're completely right with that. And it just works so much better with this music. I love those sort of hums and screeches and taps that you talked about. And it's funny that you say this is kind of a lot more like gentle and airy, which it is kind of like a save room, but also kind of on top to sort of take that further, I would say it weirdly feels like a bit of a migraine, because there's this drowny kind of nature about it, and those weird touches, that machinery stuff, gives it this kind of sort of underlying pain vibe, is sort of one way I've tried to put it. And Claire's taking a breather, but at the same time she's just kind of like, oh, for f***'s sake, like this is actually happening, you know? And so it's that mix of relax and think about it's this pain. She's getting a migraine from this. there's a lot to cope with right now, and like tone wise, I do really enjoy this type of music. And then on a production level, that kind of minimal nature is very similar to when I was kind of like first discovering music production. This was like the direction I was going, and I'm drawn to that, like playing around with pads and synth woodwind and stuff like that, those gusts that you mentioned. So yeah, this is such a great choice, and I think like like many of these picks, this is just one that I think is possibly been overlooked by people due to using the OG soundtrack, and this one's really strong. And this is the soundtrack kind of jumps around between chaotic and bombastic, and then ones like this, which almost kind of directly tie into that sort of deep, meaty part of the story that you've talked about. And yeah, big fan of this one.
Yeah, I think that the sort of lack of coherence that we were talking about before is kind of where that migraine-y sort of feeling comes from, because a lot of the like pads and stuff that you mentioned, they're just like sliding on top of each other. They all seem to, it's not like one and then the next, it's just kind of doing its own thing, which creates that almost kind of suffocating atmosphere, even though the actual tones they've used aren't particularly threatening or anything, but because there's just sort of stuff going on and doing its own thing. Yeah, it's an interesting way to put it, certainly. Cool. Right, well, number 8 is Looming Dread. I think some people are probably going to be a little bit upset that this is quite high up the list. I think people love this one. It's got big hype feels for certain. This is definitely an increase in tempo from the last one. Specifically, this is Hunk's, aka Hunk's theme. I think for me, I find some of the side games in RE, like Force Survivor, fun at first, but kind of short and repetitive and a little bit tiring and boring the more you just play them over and over again. Enemies in the same spots and stuff like that. So I'd never find myself particularly playing RE2s, Force Survivor, or overly playing Mercenaries in general, but thinking about RE3 and stuff. This one, though, when you've got like a banger like this sort of pushing you on, it certainly helped me feel like, yes, I need to unlock Tofu. I need to get through this, which once you boot up for Survivor, your first few attempts are going to end pretty miserably. It is an uphill climb. I don't think it's really fair to compare the original 98 soundtrack and the 2019 soundtrack too much, because they're so different. That being said, this is just straight up better than the old boring Hunk theme, which is just like a really short, like kind of goofy loop, to be honest. This is the kind of music that Hunk deserves. This is what he needed in a modern Resident Evil game as his sort of grand return. On Spotify, there's so many different names that are associated with the soundtrack. On Spotify, this particular track is credited to Kantaro Nakajima. Can I just say, this man knows exactly what he's doing with creating a pulse synth beat. There's like this wonderful texture to it. This combination of like a pseudo bass line thing and then this synth kick drum. They're out of kilter with each other, but in a way that you don't notice unless you're actually really listening out for it. And then it swells and swells and swells, and then you get these violins that explode in. And considering that the violins are just... They're very erratic. They're kind of like... It feels like it could all shake apart at any moment. But I find this a very hummable melody that the violins are playing nonetheless. Super awesome hype track. There are better tracks in the soundtrack, but it was always going to make the top 10.
Yeah, big hype is correct for this. What's like some of the other terms kids use? Like, no right to go this hard. It's lit, it's fire. Like, all those things apply to this. I'm with you. Like, it even sounds like it's got gunshots in it as well. And I think it's likely just the drums have been tweaked in a way to sound like shots, but I love that. And like weirdly, like you, those sort of side things like Hunk can be tiring. And I think for the original, I can count on maybe two hands twice the amount of times I've personally attempted that original Hunk run. Remake 2 might be more punishing, but I was doing a lot of it during my speed running, and then this music, it just 100% pushes you to keep going, which is kind of pretty much the aim as you're speed running. You know, like you're trying to dodge everything, and to have this there is very helpful, and yeah, it is an absolute banger. I'm gonna go a little bit further with my shall we say, analysis and extrapolating on this one. So those violins, they're sort of mixed with like that weird little glitchy mini bridge sound effects at 58 seconds, I think it is. And like the combination of all that stuff makes it truly sound like a nightmare. And it's all a bit weird and trippy. And that's like exactly what Fourth Survivor is. You're just overcome with zombies and BOWs, this total nightmare situation. And it captures that. It's so different to other stuff on the soundtrack, but it captures that feeling of being in a nightmare. And I think Hunk as a character just seems to only become more beloved every time he appears. And this music it's like, oh yeah, let's help replant that flag with this absolute banger. And so it's done him a lot of favors in that respect. And really, really enjoy it. And just because I know the fandom will love this, I also really enjoy it because it was used in the RE Verse beta as well.
As it should be, because it's big hype. Yes. Just like RE Verse. Totally. It's one of those things now where if we get some kind of Hunk reappearance, I don't exactly know what that would entail, but outside of RE Verse, this music needs to come along in some form. We need to reference this music. Like, screw the RE2 theme and its weird, weird piece of music. This needs to be Hunk's theme going forward. There's a reason why when people are just discussing Hunks in like a Discord server or on Twitter or whatever, someone will come in and just post the theme and be like, there it is. And we'll be like, yep, there it is.
It is, it's everlasting, that's for sure.
Definitely. Okay, staying up tempo. Number 7 is Collapse. So something that's really cool about Resident Evil 2 Remake's soundtrack, and you kind of asked about it, does Leon use the straight and winding, is largely the game, depending on what character you pick, doesn't matter for the soundtrack, but there are a few pieces that get swapped out, that they have kind of unique themes. Most importantly, Leon and Claire have different final bosses, so they should have different final boss themes, and they also have different escape themes, which is really interesting and cool. Even though their escapes are largely the same, it is cool. It's nice because I think the Escape the Lab is such a staple of the series that making the Escape the Lab theme is really important. So it's cool they went, well, what if we did 2 really good Escape the Lab themes? Like Looming Dread, this is hype AF. But it has some real restraint to it. For quite a decent length of the song, it's trying to hold itself together, trying to hold it in a bit. You've got these dancing violins, the underpinned brass. I'm a sucker for brass, as everyone knows. These percussive sort of military rolls. It really keeps you on the edge as things just keep getting louder and more chaotic, and as you're running through all these corridors where the walls are exploding around you and then the floor sort of caves in and all that, everything collapses, pun intended. And then you do get that moment, it's about 90 seconds in, when the brass goes, right, out of the way, boys, and just takes center stage, which is just awesome. It just, like, you can feel it. If you're playing the game, like, and you haven't played it before, or you haven't played it in a long time, or you're playing on a difficulty that you're not used to, you'll feel this in your chest at this point. It's so perfectly apt for the part of the game that it takes place in. Just super cool, and exactly what a modern and Remake 2 being very cinematic is exactly what it needed.
Yeah. So I know you've been kind of mostly positive about it there, but here, this is one of the first times we're going to have words about this list.
Okay.
Now, I know this is your list, and okay, this made your top 10, but the fact that this didn't make your top 5 is incredibly upsetting to me.
Okay, that's fair.
But yeah, sure, this is your list. Yeah, whatever. But so, because this track, this is, I've said it before, I think, to a few people, this has become easily one of my favorite pieces of music across the franchise, not just this game. I love this piece of music. There is obviously a lot of music in RE, but this is just so powerful. And, you know, you've touched on it. You have in your kind of breakdown of it. And this is one of the ones that I mentioned earlier. Once I'd started playing with the soundtrack for the remake, this was always one that really, really stuck out to me, kind of more than anything. It is kind of throwback to RE2 a little bit with some of the stuff that goes on and those final themes you get in the game. But it is also, it's kind of brand new as well. And it's got that power behind it. And we talked about the violins on some of the other tracks as well. But interestingly, and this is another one where I've been listening to this, and I thought about this the first time I heard it. So the violins, I think these are about as close to a sample as you can get without actually being a sample. And I think in music, when you sometimes look in, you know, the inlays, you'll see interpolation of so-and-so, and it's like, it's not quite a sample, but they take a structure of other music and they reuse it. Let's make sure I say this properly. So Dmitri Shostakovich, Symphony No. 7 in C major, Leningrad. Right? Now, those words might mean absolutely nothing to anybody, but so this is a huge reference point in this track. And just to be clear, I'm not some kind of classical music expert, but that piece of classical music has been used in some modern songs. Some great tracks. One of them is Ill Manners by Plan B. The other is The Phoenix by Fall Out Boy. And though just those songs, the violins in those songs, it kind of goes dun 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 dun. Right. It's almost like a gallop with the violins, and it's here in Collapse. And I went and listened to the original classical music and listened to this, and it's not identical, but there's no way. I think it has to have been a reference point. You know, they're obviously listening to a lot of classical music, and some people listening might be aware of that sample that I'm talking about. But I encourage you to go and listen to Dmitri Shostakovich, Symphony No. 7 in C major, Leningrad, and you will hear those violins from this track. And then once that brass hits in, just my God, you're like, I'm already freaking out. This whole place is collapsing, and now there is this literal siren just shouting at me, just whom, whom, and it just builds and builds, and I absolutely love it. This is such a brilliant escape theme, and as I've said, it's become one of my favorites in the franchise. I'm going to stop talking, otherwise I'm going to talk about it for another 20 minutes. But great choice. Just very upset it didn't make your top 5.
I know it's a popular one, and there's definitely we should do a tier death experience on just the 2 escape themes from this game. Yeah, because I feel like that's definitely a discussion all in itself that I'd love to get loads of different opinions on, because I'd love to see what side everyone lands on it. So now I know which one your favourite is. That's good to know. I certainly wasn't expecting classical music facts to be dropped, but that's awesome. I am absolutely 100% going to have to look into that. That's really cool. There you go. Learned something. And it's funny that you ended about, there's a literal siren going on. My brain is playing this music to me while we're talking to it. Those big brass hits, literally, they're paced out so perfectly that it actually just sounds like a siren going off as well. Yep. Like when it really gets big and it's just boom, boom. It's like an alarm within the music, which is great. Mm-hmm. Very well thought through. All right, number 6. Here we go. Is RPD Hall. This one might be the controversial one, maybe, perhaps, in its third appearance on Now That's What I Call Survival Horror to date. The
That's
RPD
so
Hall
far.
theme. Yeah, that's so far, right. So, Remake 2 largely doesn't remake the original OST, which I don't think is something that we've talked too much about. We've talked about how it's kind of referenced it, and you got the leitmotif and stuff like that it does similar. But it doesn't just one for one take any of the songs and just go, we're just going to do that. Some of them are fairly similar, but most of them, like the first floor and the second floor, and you don't get any of that. It's something completely original. But if we were to enter the RPD in this game and we didn't hear the big church bell, I think that would have been a big mistake. It would have been very, very wrong. And so perhaps it sounds very silly and a little bit trite, but I think that really, really would have upset some people. So we needed a reference to that classic piece of music. And what makes it even better is this version almost... The way, just the first few seconds are brilliant. It almost drags itself to life as you come through the doors. Like someone sort of spinning an old vinyl record up. It just sort of like rises to itself. And then once we get through just the touch of nostalgia at the start, it kind of floats, much in the same way we're talking about Straight and Winding and a lot of the other music in the soundtrack. It just kind of floats from moment to moment. You've got all these sort of memorable motifs from the original game, but in like soft, ghostly Remake 2 style. It's very loose, it's very airy, it's very open, which kind of makes the precinct feel very empty because of the music. It feels very haunted. It feels hollowed out. This version I find to be a lot sadder than the original, which is perhaps appropriate, because if you were to look at the whole of the RPD in 2 and 3, it's not... I mean, it's a very sad location with some terrible stories that happened in it, but the main hall isn't really the focus of that. A lot of the destruction and stuff that you see and read about is elsewhere throughout the corridors and stuff. But Remake 2 specifically has some big sort of cutscenes and big moments, and most importantly, the player sort of organically coming across Marvin getting up as a zombie. Done outside of a cutscene. It just kind of happens, and you as a player have to deal with it how you want to deal with it. And that moment is obviously very memorable, and this track specifically makes me think of that, sort of coming back into this sort of reasonable place of safety. The sad music makes a whole lot more sense when Marvin finally sort of succumbs to his infection. It's not I don't think it's a scratch on the original. I'm quite surprised that it got as far as number 6, but listening back to it, I think it's very underrated.
Yeah. This is a difficult one for me to analyze. Basically, because nothing in my mind, and this is complete bias, nothing can just replace the original RPD Hall for me.
Absolutely.
And I think I made my feelings clear on that when we did Resident Evil 3, and how I feel about that. Spoilers, it's one of the greatest pieces of music of all time and ever. But you make great points about the sadness, and I think that is the key thing here. And the way that links into Marvin, great observation. It totally works with Marvin being such a big part of the game. And yes, it's softer and emptier, a little bit like you've mentioned as well. But it has those references to the original theme, for whatever reason, whether they had to put them in or not. But for me, because it has those references and because nothing can replace the original, that almost makes me enjoy this less.
Right.
It's not a bad piece of music by any stretch. It's actually pretty fantastic. It has those subtle layers that bring kind of feeling of tragedy, as you say. But because it has those references, and I'm biased and an idiot, it feels too much. It feels like a fan homage. This is like a Resident Evil fanfic, but the music version. And because of my kind of deep personal connection with the original, I'm like, I would have rather they just made something 100% completely new and didn't touch those references. I get why they did. I'm just, that's kind of where I feel, that's where I land on it. And yes, the track is mostly new, but it has those little echoes of RPD Hall 98. And all that being said, I do think it is objectively great, and I can see why this would make your list. But I'm just like, not my RPD Hall, not my RPD Hall. which
The statue's
I
in the
know
wrong place.
yeah. Like, I know it's irrational, but hey, humans are irrational all the time. So yeah, that's how I feel.
At least I like that. I like it. Here's my opinion, but also here's why it's arguably wrong. It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, I get it. I do get it. I agree with you in the sense that I think it was important. As I said when I opened it, I think it's important that they did this in some form. You couldn't just have avoided it. It is the central theme of the game. It's the main hub theme of Resident Evil. Like no other game. Not everyone thinks all these classic RE games have a hub, and they absolutely do, but not all of them have this is sort of like the core of the area theme. So there was no getting away from doing something that was reminiscent of what they did. I think they did a fantastic job without treading on the legacy. So, but that's just me.
I suppose.
I'm going to keep it controversial, don't you worry. Number 5. Number 5 is Save Theme Model Screen. I couldn't resist putting this in here. It's it sucks that we don't get this version of the save theme in the main game. It sucks that this actually exists but isn't part of the campaign through the actual story of the game. I understand why it isn't, because you need that silence is a big part of Remake 2's sound's identity, where it's all about the ambient noise of the station and Tyrant's footsteps stomping around. You don't want music necessarily distracting from moments like that, really memorable moments. But yes, this is the extended version of the save theme. I think if on first sort of listen to it, I think you'd be forgiven for thinking that it is just a simple updated conversion. And to an extent, it is really just what it needs to be. That is correct. They haven't gone over the top with it. There isn't, if anything, there's less bells and whistles. It has that really distant, ethereal droning in the background that ties it into the rest of Remake 2 soundtrack. And a melody that every single person who's played the original Resident Evil 2 knows is very much intact. It might even be prettier than it's ever been. What's something that I didn't even necessarily realise until listening to it recently is that they've actually changed the instrumentation completely. It seems to be played on a harp, which is really cool, because I always felt like the fact that it was played on a piano is quite a big part of its identity in Resident Evil 2. It's a very strong sound that save room theme has in the original game. So then to be bold enough to change it, you could just play it very gently on a piano, transpose it up an octave or two or whatever. But the fact that they appear to have changed, it sounds like a harp to me. That seems like a really nice, kind of understatedly bold decision. It is simple, but I still think it's effective all these years later. Its placement in the game, perhaps notwithstanding being basically relegated to an option screen where you look at your action figures, notwithstanding, I still think it's just a great piece of music.
Yeah, I'm so happy you picked a not in the actual game screen piece of music. Like, I'm having flashbacks to picking options screen from RE3. So yeah, this is a great pick. Now, to completely contradict myself on that previous one we talked about, this one I do enjoy the references to and the echoes of the original. Yeah, they're there, and maybe the instrument change kind of helps that. And I think you're right. I think it is a harp. And it's very hard to disagree that there isn't something much prettier about the way it sounds here compared to the original. And weirdly, if it being a harp, it almost and this might be being stupid, but it kind of ties into even just the art style of the RPG itself with the statues and, and that kind of thing. I can kind of imagine one of those statues holding a harp,
Sure.
and it fits right in. So yeah, and the feeling of it, it is very strong. It hits you in the feels, as people say,
Right.
and it's weird though. It almost feels less like a save room theme, because it does feel pretty, but again, the sadness is there. This is like you've lost a lover or something. Like it's just so. It's less feels less protective and more mournful.
Yes. Yeah.
And I still prefer the less subtle nature of the one in the original, but yes, this is great. And I sometimes think, music can run a risk of like losing some character if you try too hard to be soft and subtle. And you mentioned, I think, towards the start, arguably, that some of this music is lacking in content and the soundtrack's lacking in content, which, is a fair thing to say, but whether it's good or bad is up for debate. And yeah, so I love subtle music, but I think I find myself always preferring less subtle music, and I think that's what's appealing about a lot of 80s music, which of course the original soundtrack draws a lot from.
Right.
And there's like nothing subtle about 80s music. People just discovered all this colorful stuff you could do with synthesizers, and the world has never been the same again. And this is not 80s sounding here in the modern one. It's more elegant, has kind of a natural feel to it. I think this definitely belongs in the top 5. Yeah, it is special, and we keep referencing the original. I'm like, I prefer the original. Thinking about this list here, this does belong in the top 5. This is one of the best ones on the soundtrack, so we can agree there for sure.
Excellent. Okay, well, it's appropriate that you described it with the word mournful, because number 4 is Mournful Pursuit. Let's bring this way up tempo after that. This might well be the most bombastic track on the soundtrack as a whole, which it should be. It is the final battle with Birkin. Well, save for G5, I guess. This is the end boss for Claire's campaign. Your fight against this monstrosity that is itself completely lost its grip on reality and jumped right off into bombastic madness. It can't really keep itself upright, and you get to wield a Gatling gun at it. It's exactly how the game should end, with the most nonsensical, epic ridiculousness. I really like the Birkin themes across both RE2s. It's a really tough choice. I went back and forth between this and Third Demise, which is the G3 fight. But there is such a grandeur to this that I just can't get enough of it. It literally starts with the RE2 leitmotif as like an entry point, and then it becomes this lumbering rhythm which so perfectly matches this. I can't even describe what Birkin G4 is. It's sort of a quadruped, but it doesn't move like anything in reality, does it? It's become its own otherworldly beast, which is so perfectly great for like the way that the brass sort of lumbers along, and the strings that kind of like, there's this moment where the brass and strings just keep going down and like scaling down, that I find very memorable but also very threatening, which is exactly what you want to have a final boss fight. And of course, most importantly, you need that Latin choir that is just a big part of Resident Evil 2 in general. In 98, perhaps, it's went a little bit too hard, but it just fits in so well here, sort of swelling in the background of the track. The Latin choir part can't really overstate that it plays a huge part in making this track just come together. It makes the track feel larger than life. even though it isn't really used for the actual driving melody of the thing. It just underpins absolutely everything about this. It's an epic moment of the game. It needed an epic piece of music. Mournful Pursuit. It was as far as versus the two final boss fights, this one was easy for me.
Okay, so you know me and my references, right? I do
Here
love
we
to
go.
make a sick reference. This is total Godzilla. That
Yes.
you must know the famous Godzilla riff,
Yep.
piece, whatever it's called. I won't call this a rip-off because it's not, but that big bass drop feels like such a brilliant homage to the famous Godzilla theme, and it makes sense considering where this appears in the game, So, and then it does it again when the brass kind of goes down the scale later in the track, and it's just like, it's pure Godzilla. Those who know the piece of music I'm talking about should be able to hear that. And yeah, it's brilliant. There's so much going on in this track, and there's a lot to enjoy. There's a lot to pick apart. This it's weird that it's called Mournful Pursuit because it's not mournful compared to the previous piece of music. This feels way closer to the original feel of the boss themes, but still very new as well. This is like a pure demon god here to finish the job and take your soul type piece of music, which, that choir helps with. Brilliant boss fight video game music. I'm not sure what else you want, really. It's weirdly supposed to be like this terrifying track, but this honestly just makes me smile, this piece of music. There's so much fun to be had with this one. This is definitely a top 5. I agree.
Excellent. Cool. Well, I don't think I have anything else to say on it. I'm glad we're in agreement. Suck it, Mr. X. Your boss fight theme sucks. Well, maybe it doesn't suck, but it certainly it wasn't really a consideration. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm going to stay with Claire's scenario because that's hello. I'm sorry. That's what I do. But number 3 is expansion. So yeah, one step back from the final boss theme, we are talking about the other Escape the Lab theme from Claire's scenario. Unlike the final boss theme conversation, which was very one-sided, both of the Escape themes have made this list. But this one edges it out for me. They're both really good, but this one I feel is exceptional. It starts with this... It's almost like a call and response. It feels like it wants to be a call and response, but it just goes unanswered, which is really interesting. This on the violin, which kind of sets the tension right immediately. You've got the leitmotif of Resident Evil, Resident Evil 2, that comes in immediately after that, and then it changes immediately again to this strange piano, like looping, arpeggiated sort of piano part that sounds literally like someone being wheeled in on a crash cart in a medical drama. It would not be out of place in ER or whatever show you want to pick, Grey's Anatomy, I don't know. And then the most important thing about why this rocketed so high up the list is the fact that the violins then come back from the beginning that I was talking about, this unanswered call and response. Then you get the leitmotif coming back as well. And all three things just come together. If you don't know what I mean by that, please go back, skip back, or go find it on wherever you listen to your music and just listen to the music sort of and think about it piece by piece. And then listen to all those pieces come back together to sort of like contribute to the overall effect. Piano, if done right, I know it's an easy thing to say, but if piano is done right, it really adds so much to music like this, and you get like a real human feeling that is not in Leon's Escape theme, and it doesn't need to be. It absolutely doesn't need to be, but I think it's perfect for the fact that as Claire, you are not just trying to escape yourself, you are responsible for getting Sherry out of there as well. So it adds to the sort of desperation, and it adds a more personal touch than Leon's theme, which is a great cinematic moment. But this has some humanity in it as well, which is quite important. I'm not here to bash on Welcome to Raccoon City, but if they had made a film that was just a Remake 2 film, I'd be writing angry letters to the studio if this piece of music didn't appear in it, because it is modern cinema perfection, this piece of music.
Yes, we'll definitely have no bashing of Welcome to Raccoon City. Thank you. Look, I know that I bigged up Collapse. I bigged it up a lot, and I think the bombasticness of Collapse kind of makes me enjoy it more in the context of the game, but here we are, and yeah, you're kind of totally spot on with this, and how we originally mentioned how that other piece of music was just more relevant to Claire. It happens again here, and yeah, the piano making an appearance, this puts it in a very different league to Collapse, and it absolutely works better. I think as a callback kind of to the themes from the game, both musically and narratively, just in terms of how it makes you feel. And I'm sure, I don't know if this is the exact piano from the original, but in the final cutscene when Claire is like, I have the antidote, I have to give it to her, that's when the music drops and it does the little piano as well. So it's very similar to that. And so this is definitely a much more intelligent piece of music when you put the two Escape themes side by side. And yeah, just going back to how it ties into Claire and Sherry and all that emotion. I'm not going to go as far in saying you've convinced me that this is better, but this is like, I'm gritting my teeth because you make such a damn good case. And, you mentioned Tear Death Experience. So that's basically what we're doing here. We're doing a mini version of that. And yeah, it's a funny thing about taste, because I would argue that, like, in many ways, you and our tastes are kind of very similar, particularly with some music. And then I think about it is, what is it that's making us land in different places on these two Collapse themes, two Escape themes? So I'll put you on the spot, and I know you usually host, but do you have any thoughts on why that is? What is this? Is this character based? Because here I am, sort of going nuts for this Leon one, which is, yeah, all right, it's just ridiculous. And then there's this Claire one, which is a lot more emotional. And is it just tied to how many times we've heard the other, or because I'm sure we can agree they're both superb pieces of music. Collapse has made your top 10, and there's no wrong answer, but there's two people who love Resident Evil 2. Why do we go on these different escape routes?
I do.
See what I did?
I did wonder about that. When I was looking at this, I was like, I've picked three pieces of music that are, well, two of them are specifically from Claire's campaign, and one of them, as I pointed out, just feels like it fits her campaign a lot more. And is that because I played the game more as Claire? I probably have played it more as Claire at this point. It was the campaign that I started with. It's, my favourite character in the series. Yeah, I have to wonder if that is a deciding factor. Am I just more interested in that narrative, that story of part of the Resident Evil 2 story more, and that's why the music lands with me, because it does feed into that story so well. But it might well be, in this particular case, as you have just pointed out, there is no wrong way. These are all opinion lists, and that's the beauty of it. There is no wrong way to do a top 10 music list. The way that you did your RE3 was perfectly valid. I think Steve said before, he's like, he just picks the stuff that sounds good to him, and that is absolutely the way you should do it. Maybe you're right. Maybe I just put this in here because I'm a nerd, and I was like, look at the way it just like does three things and then puts those things together.
Yeah,
it might well just be that. Also, not to get too far ahead of myself, maybe I just this. They're both. No, I would say this is much more heroic sounding to me. And there's no, that can be the case with an escape theme or not. It doesn't have to be. It can sound more terrifying, or it can sound more like you're going to save the day. And maybe at this point, that's what appeals to me. I don't know, but it could be any of those factors. I'm glad that both of them are so good that we can have this debate, though.
Yeah, and I cannot argue that Claire's campaign is just far more interesting. Oh god, I'm gonna get slaughtered for saying that. Like there is a lot more connection going on with it, and like I love Claire, and I played as Claire first as well, and I think I prefer Claire's to Leon's, but I don't know, it's just something about the music. I think sometimes it's in two minds with video games, like it's like, do I want the ridiculousness today,
Right.
or do I want do I want to be do I want to connect with this today? It's weird, isn't it? Games are just so unique in that way, and it's the same with movies. Like we can love terrible movies for weird reasons, and
Like
I love
Raccoon
it.
City.
Exactly. I love that they're both on this list, as you say.
There you go, Remake 2 offering different things for everyone. There you go. All right, number 2 is Black Impact. I wouldn't say this is my personal favourite track of the soundtrack, obviously, which is why it's number 2, but I think it might be the most iconic piece of new music for Resident Evil 2 Remake. It actually became sort of a bit of a meme in our house, because the remake came out at the same time that Resident Evil 2 the board game did. So anytime that we were playing Resident Evil 2 the board game, and we would have to spawn the Tyrant miniature into the into the playing area, if you like, somebody would do the sort of bass drop noise that's in this song, like it's like, oh, here he comes, and just that that sound became like a thing. My partner she's fairly well versed in Resident Evil by osmosis. She doesn't necessarily. We played Revelations 2 together, but she's not really played the games. But from me playing Remake 2 around her, she very much became aware of Tyrant's theme and how imposing it was, and just kind of what that sound sort of meant for you as the player. The beat of this track is scarcely what I'd call percussion. It is essentially... It sounds like giant machines just turning over and clonking and crunching in a weirdly threatening kind of way. It's a really mechanical, robotic rhythm that is, I'm sure intentionally, is basically just meant to sound like footsteps. And it gives Mr. X that Terminator vibe that he needs big time, by being a piece of music which is mostly made up of mechanical sounds, and it does all these layers of different synth textures as well, and the way that it sort of spins between them is almost sort of nauseating. It's just a bunch of layers of synths and that weird bass drop and stuff, which makes your blood go cold. Like I said, if you were listening to this, us Resi fans are a little bit weird, and we'll listen to this scary music for our own sort of comfort and joy sometimes. If you're walking home at night down a dark alley and this comes on, and that bass drop thing that I mentioned plays, you are looking over your shoulder. There's no question about it. It's remarkable how effective this piece of music is, considering it is just mechanical grinding sounds and weird pulse sound effects. There's very little actual instrumentation in it. It's just a wall of coming sound. And for all the X Gon Give It To You memes, which were all fun and games, that if I had to pick a reason that I wanted to do this episode, is just to say that I don't think this track gets shouted about really like it should. And much like Hunk's theme in Remake 2 completely just trashed the original in quality, this is way better than the original Tyrant theme from the 98 version. Just remarkable. And I am shocked that people don't talk about this piece of music the way that I think about it.
Yeah. There's been like a lot of agreement on this list. Now, I'm mostly with you here, and
here we
I will
go.
elaborate. Now, I do really love this, and I hear this a lot because I've tested it on like First Aid Spray video edits and things like that, and so all those noises and weirdness are kind of ingrained on me. it uses a few of what I like to call movie trailer tricks.
Right, yeah.
So that big dropout sound, you always hear that in a movie
Yeah, you
trailer.
do. Yeah.
It's a bit overdone, but it's fine and it's good, and you kind of want it in a movie trailer. And something else you always hear in movie trailers, and I definitely have a soft spot for this one. I do not know the technical term, but I'm going to call it an audio flicker, where basically
Mm.
like a few lines in the bar are cut out, and you get this weird kind of
Yeah.
like
Like a stuttering.
radio tune. Yeah,
Mm.
stuttering. But it's very clean. So it uses them, and so whenever I hear this, I can't remember if this was the music for the trailer of RE2.
I have
I'd
no
have to go
idea.
back and check, but it's very movie trailer this music, and it has got the Terminator vibe, as you say. Maybe also verging on like a bit of steampunk as well. All that
Mm.
piston machinery
Mm.
closing in on you while you're on some kind of like bad trip. It's it's got like a weird lack of obvious instrumentation, as you say, just a bunch of terrifying noise. I wouldn't have put this at number two. And I was just listening to you talk about it there, and it's again like I agree with so much of what you're saying, and but then again, I think because I'm selfish and this isn't what I want for a Mr. X theme, I'm gonna stamp my feet and write something outlandish on the internet about why I didn't get what I want. And it's for me, Mr. X is okay. He's obviously based on like a Terminator-like figure, and but I've never bought into this idea that he's mechanical anyway. And I know we know that he's not, at least from what we understand.
Right.
But I don't know. I just think I would have preferred something more closer to horror than sci-fi for Mr. X. It doesn't mean this music is bad. It is very clever, and for all the reasons you mentioned. I think this is a piece of sci-fi music,
Mm.
mostly, and of course, RE is a mix of horror and sci-fi. There's parts of it where I think, oh, I would have liked less, fewer robot sounds here and more monstery sounds, which is such an arbitrary way to kind of get my point across. I suppose I'm just trying to give like offer a different take, really, because it is a great piece of music. It's not as good as Collapse, but you've put it at number two. There's a lot going on in this movie trailer, Mr. X theme, but yeah, it's a fine choice.
Okay, that's fair. I absolutely see where you're coming from. I hadn't thought about the movie trailer thing. You're 100% right though. I am one of those people that hates, I'd say, modern day movie trailers, but they've been the same for like 15 years. So, well, can you call it modern anymore? All the tropes are awful. That being said, maybe I like it more because I've never experienced it in a video game as like an active part of the video game either. It's not just that bass drop thing, as I keep calling it, is yeah, I've never heard it as part of like an active video game soundtrack that just occurs throughout the game. It is these days relegated to movie trailers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that makes it unique. I see what you're saying about the mechanical sound, but I would say what I like about it is that it separates Mr. X even more so from Birkin. Like Birkin gets the sort of wild, out of control, and all the choir and all this stuff. Whereas
Yes.
Tyrant,
Yeah.
he gets something much more that sounds like he's an intentional creation. Yes, he's
Yes.
not a
Yeah.
robot, but he is designed for purpose. It's not a piece of music that you would listen to for in the same way that you would listen to most of the stuff, even something like something like Collapse or Expansion. But it's so high up for me because it is so perfectly fit for purpose. It
Yeah.
in the same way that some of your RE3 picks were memorable because where they were in the game, it so perfectly suits what I want and what I needed and my experience with Mr. X in this game. Is it a technically proficient piece of music? In some senses, but also arguably it's barely music. It is someone went into a factory and just recorded for an hour and
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you've basically convinced me. That's completely right. That idea of Mr. X being like a purposeful creation, which does lend itself more to this, yeah, the intricacies of a robot and stuff like that. Yeah, it's good. Like I said, I'm not trying to hate on it. I don't dislike it. I'm just, it was just the take I had.
no,
'Cause
that's
I thought,
fair.
yeah,
Just
but
speaking for
yeah,
the audience. That's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what
Yeah.
it is. Okay, here comes the big one then. Number one is The Reign of Morning. So this track may or may not appear on the soundtrack depending on what version, because it's not from the actual original game. This is from the free DLC. This is the theme that plays during Kendo's Ghost Survivors campaign. If you've been with us since close enough to the beginning of First Aid Spray, or you've gone back and listened to all the archives, I'm fairly certain that this should be no surprise. I'm fairly certain that I said in that podcast how much I love this piece of music. I think I said it might be one of the best pieces of music that the series has ever done. If I didn't, all these 3 years later, that is certainly what I believe now. It's really hard to talk about why in that case. When you love something so much, it's kind of like, how do I kind of put my thoughts together on this? This track has absolutely everything that you need for what it's trying to achieve. It has this sort of sad desperation that it starts off with, this moment where it kind of almost feels like realization in the intro, and then you've got this beat and piano that kicks in as you're fighting your way through the street outside Kendo's gun shop to get to the RPD, and then as you go down the ramp, Kendo's watch, I guess we can assume, just starts beeping wildly, and then it's time to effing go, and it kicks off. It somehow manages to combine something that is as emotionally poignant as the Outbreak theme is, and something that is as hype as Revelations 2's raid mode into one song. As you sort of weave through the sewers, as getting to play as Robert Kendo for the first time ever in the series, trying to make your valiant last escape against this huge wave of enemies. As I sort of alluded to, maybe I'm just getting to be a sucker the older I get, but I love a good heroic theme. And of course this has the brass lead section, so it already gets, bonus points for that. But if you ever need to get something done, put this piece of music on and you'll get it done. It makes me, and I'm just going to assume that it makes other people want Kendo to get out so bad that you just headcanon that this is real. Remake, arguably, in canon, that's a whole other debate. If Remake 2 is canon or it exists in its own universe, I can absolutely argue that this scenario is not a what if, as if it was intended. This can be canon as far as I'm concerned, based purely on how hype the music is alone, because I'd be let down if I get through Kendo to this awesome track, but it doesn't actually happen. It's got this piano that starts off in the intro that then persists into the main part, and it's like the leading instrument. It's got this synth pulse throughout. It's got this really sick breakbeat thing going on. I literally could listen to this for hours. I probably have at this point. I don't know how you make dance music in the vein of Resident Evil, but they did it. It feels desperate and heroic. It feels beautiful and bombastic. It's brilliant. It is not just the best track in Remake 2 for me. It's top 5, possibly even top 3 track of Resident Evil, period. So this was, when I wrote this list, number 1, boom, went straight in. Everything else was where the decisions had to be made. This was always going to be my number 1.
Yeah. Can I just say, I think it's going to be difficult for me to kind of summarize the track more appropriately than you have. So I'll just kind of say how it makes me feel.
That's fine.
This is this is a combination of like thumping video game music and cinematic hero orchestra together, like in the best possible way. Yeah, it gets me so amped up, and there's lots of feeling in it as well. In terms of like how it sounds, like it's just so crazy that this is in a Resident Evil game. Yeah,
Right.
it has like it's like a dubstep intro and then a techno track with like operatic layering, and then the Resident Evil piano in there as well. And like you said, it's Resident Evil dance music, and I suppose, I will. This wouldn't be my number one. I'm with you. This is a fantastic piece of music. This lacks some of the emotion and sensibility of some of the other tracks we've touched on today, particularly those Claire ones. And that's not me saying that this track isn't without those things, but I just think some of those other ones have more. Now, yeah, it's like Resident Evil dance music. It's like
We had Resident Evil jazz and Resident Evil dance music on this episode.
Yeah.
I just want to point that out.
I think there is a part of me that with this, it's like maybe they were sat there and they're like, okay, what's big with the kids these days? And like dubstep had already peaked in the UK by this point when the game came out, but I know in the States and Japan they got it really late, and they were dominated by dance music in 2017 and 18 and 19. So this is kind of their way of making a modern Resident Evil dance track that I think that they wanted to get in there, but the result is brilliant. That's not a criticism. It's so good. I love how Kendo is represented in Remake 2. We won't go into that now, but like as far as this track goes, it's so strong. I know it sounds a little bit like I'm trying to be down on it. I'm not. It wouldn't be my number one, but this is so incredible that this has ended up in your top spot, because I think that, we said at the start about how this soundtrack may get overlooked. Like, this shows the strength in the diversity of this soundtrack.
Right.
The fact that this is your top spot and all those other things we've talked about so far. So I'm definitely not holding it against you that it's number one. It's just a hell of a track. And it's, yeah, I don't know what else to say. It surprised me that this was your number one, but listening back to it, I'm just like, God, this is so good. Like, it's another one. It's like Looming Dread. Like, it's just no right to be this good.
Yeah.
And it's great choice.
I get that completely. I think if people haven't heard me talk about this before, I think definitely they'll be being like, well, what can number one possibly be? And I don't think it's a cheat to pick the DLC. And of course, if we were to do like the sort of base vanilla game, it couldn't be my number one. But yeah, it's just one of those things where it's like sometimes when there are just things that connect with you in ways that you can't quite explain why it tops everything else, and it just does.
Yes.
It just has everything that I want out of a Resident Evil soundtrack somehow encapsulated into one track. And what makes it even better is what I didn't even mention is the fact that it is timed to how you're playing. Like, certain parts don't kick in until you get. I mean, that is up until the RPD, which is just a street and a half away. But you get this intro for as long as you essentially want it until you get out into the street, and then the piano kicks in, and then when you go descend, that's when the rest of it kicks in, which is such a cool and unique thing that they actually. I don't know. You're right. Kendo's really cool in Remake 2, so it's really nice that it feels like they actually put some real effort into giving him something really unique and memorable, because he's not coming back. When are we going to play as Kendo? When are we going to get to play as Kendo again? So they made it really special in that sense. So yeah. It was, I'll say, it's an easy number one for me. Yeah. I got some honourable mentions, if you like, before we close this up.
Yes. Yeah.
I already kind of mentioned this, but the other Birkin fight, Third Demise, that's a great part of the game, that boss fight. Obviously, very memorable. Both characters get to do it or whatever. That's however you feel about that. But I'm sure that hammers home the music even more because you hear it so often. But it is a great piece of music, and kind of like Mournful Pursuit, it is a wonderful homage to Birkin of '98. That was a really tough choice to have to cleave this out of the top 10. You also mentioned that you were happy that there was a non-gameplay piece of music, like a menu piece of music. I actually had Consequence, which is the results screen theme on here for quite a while. And then I came back to one point and was like, there is basically nothing to this. I might have some warm feelings about it for whatever reason.
Yeah.
again, fit for purpose, not all that interesting to talk about. But that was one that I was definitely considering. And also, just a special shout out to Tofu on Fire, because it's so ridiculous. Like we just talked about Resident Evil Jazz, we talked about Resident Evil Dance. My jaw hit the floor when you boot up Tofu Survivor and he gets just insane death metal with the most ridiculous shredding guitars. Not like cheesy butt rock, but like real modern death metal. Oh, yeah. It's so ludicrous that I just couldn't not mention it.
Yeah, I think they're great honourable mentions. Third Demise, I think, is probably like one of the closest ones to the original. So big influences, like, you know, the influence there. Consequence, as you say, very understated, but very cool. A great original one. And Tofu on Fire, I mean, it's on my gym playlist. Like, I'm not gonna, I can't be dishonest about that. One final point. It's so funny, when I went to listen to Tofu on Fire, I actually double checked this one on YouTube. The top comment was, how did they expect me to dodge zombies when my head's banging so hard?
Exactly. Who knew that's what we wanted from Tofu? It turns out he's secretly like this big time metalhead. That's clearly what's happened. Right, well, excellent. This has been a deep dive into the Remake 2 soundtrack, which, as I said at the top, I don't think gets the love that it perhaps deserves. Hopefully there's people that have enjoyed this episode that have come to some sort of like realization about the soundtrack, that they maybe should give it some time, give it a listen, play the game through with it on, mess with your sound settings and turn the music up a bit more and turn some stuff down, and really appreciate the work that's gone into this, because I feel like it really is one of the most underrated soundtracks in all of Resident Evil. Also in the comments, do hit me up if you are a fan of the soundtrack. Let me know what I got wrong. Let me know why Rain and Morning shouldn't be number one, and let us know, between the two Escape the Lab themes, which is your personal favourite. With all that being said, Kelsi, thank you for joining me.
No, thanks for having me. Great soundtrack, underrated, as you say. Took the words right out of my mouth.
Cool. Right, well, thank you all for listening, and have a good week.